Okay, now we remember from last week, and hopefully, Leah, if you saw last week's recording, that Hirsch's point of view in terms of all these parshiot, Truma, T'Tzaveh, Vayakel, Pekudei, they all have the details of the Mishkan and everything that's in it, all the furniture. The yesterday's laning was all the clothing of the Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol, the regular Kohanim, and it's all in very, very detail. And Hirsch's point of view is that the the purpose of the detail is to convey ideas, to convey teachings of the Torah, whether they're values, whether they're laws, whether the things that were given in Mishpatim, which immediately precedes the Truma. Um, the Hirsch's point of view is the way of preserving the ideas that come from Har Sinai and come from all of the revelation that's going to happen is through the Mishkan. And his challenge is to analyze the symbolism of everything in the Mishkan, whether it's the Shulchan or the menorah or the Mizbeach, or in our case, the Aron HaKodesh. But also he analyzes all the clothing of the Kohen, what it's made of, what colors they are, how you put them on. All of them are to convey ideas having to do with the teachings of the Torah. So it's a major uh, a major challenge, and he's really the only commentator that does this, that really takes the time and effort. And by the way, he's going to do the same thing with korbanot. When we get to Vayikra, he is going to say that unlike the Rambam, who says it's no difference if you bring a goat or a ram or a cow, those things don't make any difference. He says, no, everything is purposeful, everything is symbolic, and you can analyze all of the korbanot symbolically of why it's done this way and not that way, and why you bring these animals or these birds. So when we get to Vayikra, we'll do also an example of his analyses. And in his Chumash, he takes pages and pages and pages of doing these detailed analyses. And, it's kind of hard to read and keep up on, but, I've been studying him for decades. And so I
Yes,
took the
Steve,
time.
I'd
Yeah.
I'd be curious what he does with Zachor, with the Amalek and the Lo Tishkach.
Uh, well, that's another shear.
Yeah, I would have loved that. Yeah, maybe
Yeah,
another time we can.
he does that, and maybe because we're going to get it in Devarim because it's repeated there. That's what we learned. So maybe when we get there, we can analyze
Okay,
Amalek from
good.
this.
I'll remind you.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's look at the Aron HaKodesh, and you sort of have to follow this very carefully. You have to give your attention to it because it's building up. It builds up a whole story. In other words, each thing is symbolic, and each thing builds on something else. So let's try to do it step by step. Um, Here is the text, okay, and I put in red the key parts of the text. Vayas Betzalel et Aaron. This is what it actually looked like. Atzei Shittim. So the Aron was was essentially a box where the center of it was wood. Atzei Shittim. Shittim wood. Vayitzapehu Zahav Tahor Mibayit Umichutz. But it was sandwiched between gold. There was a gold container on the outside and a gold container on the inside, and between these two pieces was the wood. Vayaslo zer zahav savuiv, and then a rim was made around the box, okay, also of gold. Vayitzok lo arba tabot zahav arba pamos zahav, and then on the corners of the bottom of the box there were rings. There are always rings on furniture in order to carry them, because they had to put them on their shoulders and carry them from place to place. So there were rings on the four corners. Vayaspa deatse shitim, and so you made the poles of wood but covered them with gold. Vayove et habadim betabaot, and then he slid um, the poles into the rings. Al tzalot Aron, laseit Aron, but that story is not over. There's going to be another fact that's going to be critical in a moment. Vayas kaparat zahav tahor, and now that was the box, and now you make a cover. The kaparat is the cover of the box, pure gold, no wood in this, pure gold. Vayashne kruvim zahav miksha asatam, and make two kruvim. We'll talk about them shortly. Out of mishnei ketzot hakaparat, that the two kruvim come out of the cover itself. In other words, you don't make them separately and then attach them to the cover, but they're actually beaten out of the cover itself. How that's done technically, we don't know, but it's done. Kruv echad mikatzeh mizeh, kruv echad mikatzeh mizeh. The two kruvim are on the two sides of the top of the cover. Vayu hakruvim porsei kanafayim lamala, and the kruvim had wings that encircled them from the top. In other words, the wings came out of the kruvim and covered them and the top with their wings. The kanfehem al hakaporet ufnehem ish el achiv, and each kruv faced each other. El hakaporet hayu pnei hakruvim, and the kruvim were looking down towards the cover. In other words, they were facing each other but looking down towards the cover. And then the last little detail, back to the poles. V'tabot Aron yihu habadim lo yasuru mimenu. They were made uniquely where they could not be removed from the rings. That's different if you take a look at the poles that were used for the shulchan and the poles that were used for the altar, the inner altar, the gold one, and the poles that were used for the menorah. They all could be removed. But here, the poles of the Aron HaKodesh could not be removed. And of course, that's going to be significant. V'natata el ha'aron et ha'edut asher etein alecha. And you put in the Aron the Aseret HaDibrot, the two tablets that Moshe is going to get on Har Sinai. God is going to inscribe the 10 statements on these two tablets, and those tablets go inside the box. Now the last detail, v'no'adti lecha sham, and I will meet you there. V'dibarti itcha, talking to Moshe, and I will speak to you, Moshe, me'al hakaporet, from on top of the cover, mibein shnei hakruvim, between the two kruvim. In other words, God's presence is going to be manifest on top of the wings of the kruvim, and God's voice is going to come out of the space between the two kruvim on top of the kaporet. Asher al Aron ha'edut et kol asher atzaveh otcha el bnei Israel. Whenever God speaks to Moshe from the Mishkan, Because remember, a number of times he's going to call Moshe into the Mishkan, and he's going to talk to him and tell him things. Well, when that happens, God's presence is on top of the wings of the Kruvim, which is on top of the Aron HaKodesh. Okay, so these are the facts. So let's summarize these facts. First of all, this was sort of what it looks like. In other words, the cover is called the kaporet, and out of that cover is these two kruvim that have their wings that come above them, above their heads. They face each other and they're looking down. Okay, and that cover fits on top of the box. The box itself is made up of three layers: an inner gold layer, the wood core of the box, and then an outer gold layer. And then there's a gold rim around the whole thing. And then you have the two poles, but you see the poles have like big balls at the end, meaning once you put them in, you can't take them out again. They have to stay there the whole time. Okay, so you just bear this image in mind as we talk about it. Okay, so you see the box has an inner gold layer, an outer gold box, and then in the middle is the wood, and the kaporet is on top with two kruvim. So here are the main characteristics. The box itself was made from wood, but it was covered inside and out with gold, and it had a gold rim or a crown. A zer can be translated as a rim or a crown. A melech, a king, wears a crown. That's also called a zer, but also it means a rim, which if you look at the shape of a crown, it's like a rim that goes around, and you put it on the head of the king. Number two, it contained the Aseret HaDibrot, which was the symbol of the covenant between God and the people at Har Sinai. The contents were protected by a cover out of which emerged these two kruvim. The ark was transported by poles which were never removed, and God's presence was manifest above the wings of the kruvim, and God spoke to Moshe from above the wings between the kruvim. Okay, that's basically a summary of what the psukim were describing. Okay, following so far?
Mm-hmm. So far, so good.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so now the question is, what's the theme of the whole ark? Well, since the main part of the ark was to hold the Luchot HaBrit, Rabbi Hirsch sees that the ark's symbolic theme is the relationship of the Jew individually or the nation nationally to the Torah. In other words, the ark itself is going to describe the dynamics between the Jew and the Torah, which is inside the ark. Thus, the ark's five main physical characteristics relate to the Jew's responsibility to abide by the covenant by receiving, protecting, and sustaining God's Torah through everyday behavior. We'll explain that in a moment, but that's his overall introduction. Okay, now let's take it a piece by piece and see the messages in each part. Now, first of all, remember from last week, we said that each element has its own characteristic, its own symbolic characteristic. You remember what gold was? We said last week.
I remember we talked about that it doesn't tarnish.
Right. Gold represents throughout the whole thing. In other words, once something is significant as a symbol, the symbol holds throughout every place. So anything that's made with gold in the Mishkan, the gold part represents the divine.
Mm-hmm.
It represents that which is revealed by God, because gold has no impurities in it and never changes. It's eternal. We said that last week. If
Yes.
somebody found a gold ring that is 5,000 years old, it looks exactly as it did 5,000 years ago. It doesn't tarnish, it doesn't disintegrate, nothing happens to gold. So gold represents that which is eternal, which is God and God's teachings. Wood, on the other hand, is organic material. And we saw the psukim that compare metaphorically wood or a tree to a person. Remember that? Eight
Yes.
Tzadik katamar yifrach ke'erez balavonon yiskeh. That the tzaddik is considered as a great cedar, and like erez halavonon. It's supposed to, it's an enduring strong tree. And the first line of Tehillim is a person is like planted out on the riverbank, and it draws its water, and it produces leaves or produces its fruit. So it's like a human being. A human being lives for decades, and so does a tree. Trees produce uh, leaves and fruit, and human beings produce fruit, as it was. In other words, the next generation, they reproduce. And so wood is the symbol of human beings. Okay. So now what's the association between the gold and the wood? So gold, we learned, is symbolic of absolute purity and resistance to time, and it's used as a metaphor for God's absolute pure spirit in the human being, but also for the eternal truths of God's teaching. So that's gold. Since the Torah is God's revelation and expression of these teachings, gold in this context will symbolize the Torah's values, ethics, and laws. So that's the gold symbol. Organic wood, on the other hand, represents the slow, steady process of human growth and maturation, like a tree, striving towards actualization of its potential. That is, it produces fruit so that it can reproduce itself into the next generation. So in this case, wood represents the individual Jew, or on the national scale, the organic Jewish nation that grows, matures, and strives towards personal and national fulfillment. So the container now was comprised of two materials. The core of the chest itself was wood, but it's enclosed or sandwiched between two layers of gold, inside and out. Okay, so remember that picture. Now, if we apply these metaphors to the configuration of the ark, we can hear it express a statement. In other words, the symbolism speaks to us, and it concerns our personal growth in relation to the moral and ethical principles of the Torah. Also, here's a statement which the symbol is making. In other words, I'm putting into words what the symbol is expressing. You are to continually grow and progress towards the fulfillment of your individual and national potential. That's the wood, like the tree, but entirely within the boundaries of the absolute enduring principles of God's moral, ethical, and social laws, which is symbolized by the enclosing layers of gold. In other words, inside and outside, the wood is enclosed in gold. It can grow within, as it were, but it has boundaries. So what's the message? It means in our growth and development, in our personal growth and development, we are to keep within the boundaries of the gold, within the boundaries of God's moral and ethical and legal principles. Live fully, but keep your perspective. Now we know that the Torah comprises negative and positive commandments, right? There's mitzvot lo ta'aseh, that you shouldn't do, and there's mitzvot aseh, which you should do. So the message of the box is you are to exercise free-willed self-control by limitation of certain behavior. That's the mitzvot lo ta'aseh, which is represented by the inside box of gold, and proactive expression, what you should do, the moral and ethical behavior, which are the mitzvot aseh, the positive commandments, which is represented by the outside gold layer, as you grow and develop and mature. Okay, so you see the box expressing this idea that the core is wood, meaning we are to personally grow like a tree and to strive and fulfill our potential and to contribute to the next generation, to produce fruit, as it were. But we have to do that within the bounds of mitzvot lo ta'aseh and mitzvot aseh, represented by the gold inside and outside. Okay, that symbol clear?
Yes.
In fact,
Yes.
the whole quality of a genuine Jewish lifestyle is presented in this simple metaphor of the wooden chest overlaid with gold, says Hirsch. The ideal Jewish life, which he calls a mensch Yisrael, is mensch meaning you develop who you are as a person. In other words, your own talents and skills and interests and intellectual and spiritual growth, but you're also a Yisrael, which is a member of the Jewish people. In other words, you grow and actualize your human potential, but within the guidelines of Jewish moral and social law. Become who you can become, that's the wood, says the ark, while remaining responsible to and cognizant of your duty to God. So in other words, that's the whole purpose of a Jew, to grow and develop as an individual. Everybody's different. Everybody has different rates of growth. Everybody has different DNA. But the common denominator is the mitzvot aseh and lo ta'aseh, which limit or put boundaries on that growth. Now, what about the crown? Why does it have a crown around it? So it indicates that the wearer, like a king, is different and distinguishable, as well as noble and royal. Those are the two things that the crown indicates. If a king wears a crown, it means he's different than everybody else. He's the king, and that's a singular identity, but he's also noble and royal. Since the rim was formed out of the ark itself, its metaphoric meaning would be the inevitable outcome of the ideal Jewish individual and national life, which is the rim or crown around the whole box, wood bounded by gold, will be the development of a distinguished, unique, and noble character. Now, where did we hear that before? That we are to develop a distinguished, unique, and noble character.
Well, I don't know, maybe Am Skula.
Exactly. That's what we were told. Where an Am Segula means something, a special chosen people different from all the other nations, but we're also to be a Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. We're supposed to be of noble character, of representatives of God, Kohanei Hashem, and a holy nation. So the rim represents the the outcome of the successful expression of the box. In other words, the person growing and developing and being bound by mitzvot taseh and mitzvot lo taseh, and then the outcome of all of that is to be Am Segula, Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. Okay, that's so far so good. We have more things to decode. What about the Kruvim? Okay. Where did we have Kruvim before? Remember, Hirsch always looks elsewhere rather than to just make it up. He has to look elsewhere and get how the Torah itself uses Kruvim. And Kruvim appear only once in one other place in the Torah itself, and it appears in Nach many places. Where does it appear? The one place that does it appear in the Torah itself? Remember back, way back in the beginning, to Garden of Eden. Remember?
Right. Yes.
They were expelled from the garden, and God set two kruvim to
Yes.
guard the way.
Right.
Right. Okay. So and the second is going to be the kruvim are going to appear in the mikdash as like it said, God's presence is going to reside on top of the kruvim. The expression in the Hebrew expression that you see in Nach is Yoshev HaKruvim. God's presence sits, as it were, on top of the Kruvim. And that's what it said in the pasuk. It said, "I will make myself known on top of the Kruvim, mibein HaKruvim, when I speak to you, Moshe." Okay, so here's the Kruvim were made out of the cover itself, from the two sides, but one piece. In other words, it's not separate. It does the same. It does what the cover does. The kruvim had their wings spread upward, overshadowing the cover with them, and the kruvim faced each other, looking toward the cover. And you put the luchot inside the box, and you put the cover on top of the box, and the two kruvim come out of the cover and sort of put their wings over the top of the box. Okay, so yeah. Go ahead. Do you have a question? All right. See, look, watch how it develops. The Hebrew root kaporet has a connotation of covering, protecting, and preserving. We saw that with Noah's Ark, if you remember. Noah's Ark.
Kofar. Yeah, kofar.
It's to protect the ark from the water. In other words, you seal it. It's a sealant. It preserves and it protects. So the function of kaporet is to cover, preserve, and protect the contents, which is the luchot and all the teachings that it represents.
Is it related to the word kapara?
It is, because kapara, the conceptual relationship is God covers the sin. In other words, God makes it as if as you don't see it. That's kapara, and that's part of what happens in Yom Kippur. That's another story. But it's the same concept of covering something, but the real dynamic of it's protects and preserves. So out of the cover are to be fashioned two kruvim, and notes that the kruvim have two connotations. One is in the creation story, as we said, Vayigaresh et Adam. He expelled the human beings out, and Vayashkein mikedem legan eden et kruvim, and he placed on the the east side of the Garden of Eden, these kruvim that had swords, flashing swords in their hands, to guard, lishmor, et derech eitz hachayim, to guard the derech eitz hachayim. So the role of kruvim are guardians. Okay? Now, Hirsch says elsewhere that there's a difference. If God did not want human beings to ever be able to access the Eitz HaChaim, he wouldn't put up guards, he would put up a gate. Right? There's a difference between a gate and guards. If you put up a gate you can't go through, right? There's no access. But if you put up guards, then you can approach a guard and say, I have permission to go in, let me go in. In other words, because the kruvim are there as guards, they're there under certain circumstances to allow access. And Hirsch says that's important when in Devorim, when he says, I place before you two options. You can do mitzvot and choose life, or you can disobey me and choose the opposite. And then he says, choose life. In other words, what God is saying is, if you want access to quality of life, Eitz HaChaim is an expression of quality of life, a meaningful life. If you want a meaningful life, then you do it through listening to Torah and mitzvot. Then you have access. The guards, as it were, will let you through. But you have to earn it. In other words, you have to say, I have the eligibility requirements to now get access to the Eitz HaChaim, but you can only do that if you use your free choice, to choose to do Torah and mitzvah. That's what he says in Devarim. So that's why the kruvim are in the role of guardians, and there's not a locked gate that means there was never any access. It just means you have to earn it, and you earn it by your behavior. Okay, but in our case, it's not talking about that. In our case, it's talking about the kruvim are guardians. Okay, that's as far as we go. Now, we also, as I mentioned, in Nach, we have in a number of places where God is described as Yoshev Kruvim, one who dwells upon the Kruvim. The famous vision of Yechezkel, when Yechezkel has this vision of the Jewish people are going to, because of their behavior, they're going to be exiled, and they're going to lose their access to the Mikdash. It says, Ukvod Elohei Yisrael, Na'aleh Me'al HaKruvim, that God's presence is going to get up, is going to move from being on top of the Kruvim in the Beit HaMikdash over the Aron HaKodesh, and it's going to now move towards the door. In other words, God is going to leave the presence of the Mikdash because of the behavior of the Bnei Israel. Or in chapter 9 of Yechezkel, V'yaram kavod Hashem me'al hakruvim al miftan habayit v'yimalei habayit et ha'anan v'chatzer milei noga. In other words, God's presence is now moving out of the Mikdash, and he is going into exile with the rest of the people. But the point is that his image, the vision of Yechezkel of what happens, because nobody could see, even Moshe was not allowed to see God's presence in the Mishkan. It was behind the curtain, and no one could really go in there. Even when the Kohen went in once a year on Yom Kippur, he had to go in with the incense, which made a cloud, which means he couldn't really see. In other words, you can't see God's presence. But in Yechezkel's vision, he really didn't see it. It was a vision. It was like a dream vision. And he saw in that dream vision that God's presence was on the Kruvim, and it got up and it left the Mikdash. So here too, upon the ark, the kruvim have a dual function, says Hirsch. On the one hand, they clearly serve a guarding, protecting function, covering the kaporet with their wings. In other words, it looks like they're guarding, and they're looking down on the kaporet, remember? But on the other hand, they bear the divine presence as he communicates with Moshe. I will meet with you there. I will speak with you from between the two kruvim. Okay, so on the one hand, they are guarding the contents of the of the Aron, which means the Torah, and on the other hand, they are bearing the God's presence. God's presence is on them. Okay. So notice two things: the ark cover protects the ark's contents, and the kruvim guard the ark cover. And second, the material of the ark cover itself turns into kruvim, which in turn guard and protect it. In other words, says Hirsch, the symbolic image, because the kruvim come out of the cover itself, is that the cover protects, but the kruvim protect the cover, which means it protects itself. Now, what does that mean? In other words, how do you translate that? So he's saying, taking these symbolic components together to form an idea, Rabbi Hirsch suggests the following. By protecting and preserving the Torah, which is the cover, the individual Jew or the nation becomes its own protector and guardian, as well as a bearer of God's glory. In other words, by fulfilling our obligation to the Torah, which is the contents of the ark, we protect ourselves and we become the bearers of God's glory. In other words, that describes the two dynamics that the Torah describes, the effect on listening to God's commandments and living by the teachings of the Torah. What does the Torah say would happen to us when we keep the Torah? Right? And what's the consequences, the material consequences of keeping the Torah according to the Torah?
The land will produce.
Right. There will be blessings. In other words, it's in the beginning of each one of the tochachas. There are two tochachas.
Right.
The beginning of each is the positive. It's much shorter than the negative. But there's a positive, and the positive is if you keep all of this, right, then you yourselves are protecting yourselves. You're getting not only production and blessing, but you're getting security. Remember, in both of those descriptions of the blessing, is God is allowing us to have security on the land. So we're protecting ourselves, number one. But number two, we're also fulfilling the obligation to be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. We're still the bearers of God's glory. We're fulfilling our obligation to be a model nation, or to be an individual model of what the Torah wants us to be. So that's what the two kruvim are communicating symbolically. It's protecting, by protecting and preserving the Torah, we become our own protector. In other words, the source of our own blessing and security, as well as being an Am Segula and Mamlechet Kohanim.
That's really excellent. Most the other commentators pick up on that the kruvim have almost what seems to be childlike faces,
Yes.
and what that could represent. But I like this.
Usually the childlike faces is supposed to give the impression of purity. Children
Mm-hmm.
are pure
Innocence,
in a
Yeah.
sense. Not real,
right?
not
Yeah,
real children.
exactly. Not the ones I know.
Okay, but now watch his support for what he says. Very often we read the command lishmor mitzvot, right? Shmirat mitzvot. Lishmor is to guard or protect or preserve. Correct? That's what
Mm-hmm.
a shomer is, one who protects. Lishmor is to, and we use the word lishmor also to preserve. You go shopping in the supermarket and you go to the section of shimurim, which means things that are preserved in canned fruit, canned food is shimurim. Okay,
Really?
so lishmor means to guard, to preserve, and protect. Okay, the second thing we're required to do is la'asot,
Do
to
them.
to actually do it, to express them. So we always have a dual obligation in regard to the Torah's commandments: to guard, protect, and preserve, which is the kaporet, the metaphorical meaning of the ark cover, but also to practice and fulfill them in our daily life, which is the wood of the ark chest. Right? In other words, it's a combination of the two. That we are to grow and develop and choose to become what we should become within the boundaries of the Torah. That's the mitzvot aseh and los aseh, and that we are to protect the teachings of the Torah, to guard, protect, and preserve them, which is the ark cover. Okay, so now we add another dynamic from the Kruvim. As the inherent consequence of satisfying both these duties, in other words, lishmor v'la'asot, to preserve and to do, we form our own protection and preservation. In other words, we promote our own welfare by earning God's blessing, which he promised as part of his covenant, symbolized by the Kruvim coming out of the cover itself and simultaneously becoming the bearers of God's presence on earth, which in the big picture is what we're doing is inviting the presence of the Shekhinah. Remember the first line of the whole Mikdash? V'asu li Mikdash v'shachanti bitocham. Make for me a Mikdash. And if you get the message of what the Mikdash is trying to teach you, you become a holy nation, and my presence will then dwell among you. Build for me a Mikdash, v'shachanti bitocham. So the Keruvim say that as we successfully accomplish our mission of striving to be what we can be within the boundaries of what the Torah says that we should do and not do, then we become the bearers of God's presence. We invite the Shekhinah to dwell among us because we'll be an Am Kadosh. And God dwells among us when we are an Am Kadosh. Now, what about the poles? We read that the poles in the ark have a unique character to them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark and shall never be removed from it. Okay, so what's that supposed to teach? Why is that different? So Hirsch says the Torah, as a guide for ideal Jewish life, is neither confined to the place of the sanctuary nor to the time of its physical existence. Rather, the Torah accompanies the people wherever God may lead them. In other words, the poles are always there because the ark goes with us, meaning the Torah goes with us wherever we are. The Torah is always able to be transported to any continent, to any country, to any city, to any home, so that it can continue to be protected, observed, and fulfilled, thus guaranteeing the survival of its guardians and enabling them to be the bearers of the divine glory wherever they may be scattered. And Hirsch says that's a very interesting additional comment. He said that's unlike the table. The table, he will explain elsewhere, the shulchan with the lechem hapanim and all of that represents economics because there's lechem on it. It's food. So the theme of the table with food, is economic blessing. And the menorah, because of its light, its flame, represents intellectual blessing. So the table and the menorah have their poles removed. In other words, they don't travel. They don't travel. Okay, and 1 second. Let me go back to that. Right. They don't travel with you. And he said, I didn't bring it here, but he says later that this is the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. In Chutz La'aretz, the Torah comes with us. We can always learn Torah, we can always live by Torah, we can always study by Torah. It's not stuck in the Mikdash, and it's not stuck to a place. It doesn't have to be in Israel. It can be in exile too. But the table, economic blessing, and the intellectual blessing is qualitatively different in that in Eretz Yisrael is really where you get economic blessing and where you get intellectual blessing. In other words, unlike the ark, Eretz Yisrael is really the source of both material, economic blessing and intellectual blessing. And if you think historically, the Jews had a very difficult time economically. And many times they would be blessed, they become wealthy, but then the goyim throw them out, or they take from what the church did to the Jews whenever they got too powerful, they got too rich, they just got rid of them. Okay, and the menorah as well. You have intellectual blessing, but you have the pursuit of both historically, both Islam and both Christianity stunted the freedom of intellectual blessing of the Jewish people. Not that we didn't have any. I mean, they were great individual scholars, chutz la'aretz. There were, but as a people, we didn't have the freedom to have the education and to have these yeshivot and to have places in which we can produce the intellectual blessing in a sort of safe and secure and open way. And he's saying the only place you can do that is in Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, we see both those things are true. That in Eretz Yisrael, we are the startup nation, the economic blessing that we could not have in Chutz La'aretz, and we have the intellectual blessing, all of the places of learning and the yeshivot and the women's seminaries and all of that. There's no parallel to that outside of Israel. So the table and the menorah remain tied to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, they don't go with you to exile, but the Torah does. And therefore the Torah will always, no matter where we go, we can take the Torah with us. Now, he very creatively summarized this whole message in the first chapter of Yehoshua. Now look at this chapter and look at the words that are used in Yehoshua. This is what God's message to Yehoshua. Rak chazak be'amatzmaot, be firm and strong to guard, lishmor, v'la'asot, those two words, lishmor v'la'asot, kechol haTorah asher tzivacha Moshe avdi, al tasur mimenu yaminu smol. Don't deviate from it left or right. That's the inner and outer layers of the gold. They're the boundaries to tell you can only go so far. Leman taskil b'kol asher telech, in order that you act correctly in everything that you do. In other words, you become the Am Segula, the Mamlechet Kohanim, v'Goy Kadosh. And then the next pasuk says, Lo yamush sefer haTorah zeh mipicha. The sefer haTorah will be with you all the time. It will v'agita bo yomam v'layla lama'an tishmor la'asot kechol hakatuv bo, in order that you will guard and you will observe everything that's written in it. Do not fear, al techat, ki imcha Hashem Elokecha, because I am with you. My presence is with you and will never depart from you, because the Aron with the Kruvim have irremovable poles. Wherever the Torah is, that's where my presence is. And so the whole message of the Aron in terms of its symbolism is encapsulated in these two psukim of God's message to Yehoshua as he takes over and brings the people into Eretz Yisrael.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
I keep thinking about, Steve, the word lishmor means to really appreciate and value what you have, to recognize the value of what you have.
Yes, to recognize it and preserve it. In other words,
yes,
it allows you to preserve the idea.
Right, which you want to do when you really realize how valuable something is.
Right. It's like we say Shemirat Shabbat.
Yes.
Right? Lishmor. Shmor at Yom HaShabbat Likadsho. Preserve Shabbat and make it holy. So we preserve the idea of Shabbat by being Shomer Shabbat. In other words, by expressing what the Shabbat is supposed to represent. So yes, it does do that.
So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank
really,
you. Yes.
So interesting, excellent, and enjoy your interesting Purim.
Yes.
Right? And I guess we'll see you in 2 weeks, hopefully.
Okay. Good.